Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar Game Changers in the Energy Transition, organised by the Energy Transition Initiative at NTNU, the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. My name is Ruth Asgeir, and I will be moderating this webinar, which is scheduled to last until noon Central European Standard Time. And I hope that the next 2.5 hours will be inspiring. Now, as some of you may know already, this is the third webinar in a series of 5, replacing the physical energy transition conference that was supposed to take place in Trondheim in March this year. But of course, due to the corona pandemic, that could not happen. Now, in the first webinar, we heard of a world in crisis. We are nowhere near reaching the goals in the Paris Agreement, and it is urgent to change the global energy systems as a contribution to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. However, in the second webinar that was held last week, we heard that fossil energy will still constitute a major portion of the global energy mix for many years to come. And that technological breakthroughs, such as CCS, are urgently needed alongside both an increase in renewable energy production and more energy efficient solutions. Now, in light of the corona crisis, when energy consumption dropped like a stone overnight, we changed the way we live, work, and travel. What does that tell us of our capacity to make dramatic changes, either temporarily or permanently? What kind of game changes could help us in the transition? That is what we're going to explore here today, and I'm happy that we have with us 5 highly competent speakers ready to share their knowledge, their thoughts, and perspectives with us. And in addition to the speakers, we also have the pleasure, of meeting a famous expert panel, academics with in-depth knowledge about the topics at hand, and I'm going to get back to them later. Also, I would like to encourage you as participants to engage in the discussions we'll have during the next, let's say, 145 minutes. And Slido is our interactive platform. So if you think that you might want to ask a question or comment on something that the speakers say, this is how to participate. So you can grab your smartphone or a tablet or a laptop, open a browser, and then you type sly.do. Enter today's event code, which is ET as in energy transition, game changes. So it's sly.do, ET game changers. In this forum, you can comment and ask questions. Now, the most important feature in here is the like button. It is there to enhance the relevance of questions. If you see that someone has already written down something that resembles slightly something that you would like to ask, just click like on what is already there. That saves you the time to write, and it helps me out not having to read several versions of pretty much the same question and argument. And you could also name the recipient you're asking or mark it debate or discussion. I'm going to do my very best to answer or to convey your questions to the speakers as we go along. Can't promise to do it for every question that is asked, but I'll do my best. And there's going to be a short Q&A session after each presentation. And after that, I want the speakers and the experts to take part in a larger panel discussion. I'm going to try to remind you of Slido as we go along. So this is the encouragement for all of you to be active today. Now, allow me to introduce today's first speaker. Until recently, David Aikman worked at the Bank of England, where he and his team were responsible for developing the bank's macroprudential framework. Now, I have to admit that the concept of macroprudential policy is new to me, but I believe that listening to David Aikman today will give us a good insight in what it is and why it is relevant for the energy transition, and the role that the financial sector in general, and maybe central banks in particular, can play in speeding up the transition. I guess risk assessment is a key word here. As I said, David Aikman used to work for the Bank of England. However, now he has moved on to another highly renowned institution, King's College London. There he is breaking new grounds, building up a whole new research and education centre under the name of the Qatar Centre for Global Banking and Finance. I know that although he has had his new position for only 2 short months, climate change will definitely be on Professor Aikman's agenda in the times to come, as it is today, when he will explore the central bank's role in the transition to a carbon neutral economy. David Aikman in London, the floor is yours.
And thank you very much for the kind invitation to participate in this event. My name is David Aikman. Until a few months ago, I was an economist at the Bank of England, and I'm now a professor at the Business School at King's College London, where I'm running a new research centre focused on central banking issues. I'm not a climate expert, but as a former central banker, I would like to give you my perspective on the role that central banks can play in the transition to a low-carbon economy. I'll start, if I may, by looking at the parallels between climate risk and the current pandemic. There are lots of overlaps here, but I'd like to focus on the idea that these are both foreseeable risks with huge repercussions for our economies and our broader ways of life. Now, each year, the UK government produces a comprehensive risk planning document that sets out the key risks the country faces and what we're doing to mitigate them. The risk of an influenza-style pandemic has been top of this risk register for many years, but we, like many others, fail to plan adequately for it. Parallels with climate change are obvious. In both cases, I think the fundamental issue is that the risks fall outside the planning horizons of many organisations, what Mark Carney has called the tragedy of the horizon. Now, from a finance perspective, the key problem in both cases is that the risk isn't being priced. So we end up inadvertently taking on far too much risk, leading to massive failures of risk management, broadly defined. Now, until very recently, central banks were pretty much silent on the implications of climate risk for their economies and financial systems. But in the last few years, that's really changed. We've seen supervisors at the Bank of England and the ECB now publish their expectations for how financial firms should be managing these risks, including via the use of scenario analysis. We've seen the establishment of the Network for Greening the Financial System, which has allowed central banks to coalesce with regulators to share knowledge and develop scenarios for sizing and understanding the impact of climate risks. We've seen economists at the Dutch National Bank publish a desk-based climate stress test, the first of its kind internationally. Now we have the Bank of England and the Banque de France planning more ambitious stress tests, and I'll come on to say more about that in a second. Very recently, in I think a very welcome development, the Basel Committee has set up a task force to look at climate risk issues. And this is important because it's both multilateral and has the potential to result in binding requirements at some point. Let me say a few words about the Bank of England's planned stress test, which unfortunately won't now happen until next year because of the COVID crisis. The bank published a discussion paper setting out details of this exercise in November. The purpose of the exercise is threefold. Firstly, to estimate the size of the exposures of the UK's financial system to climate-related risks. Second, to elicit a better understanding of how financial institutions expect to adjust their balance sheets and business models in response to these risks, and to assess what the collective impact of these actions might be. And third, the test is there to provide a vehicle for identifying and addressing gaps in data and risk management capabilities at firms. And let me kind of add in parentheses here, an implicit aim is also to build capacity at central banks and regulators for understanding and modelling these risks, whose importance will grow in future. Now, the Bank of England's proposed test has some novel features relative to kind of the more plain vanilla macro stress tests the bank has been engaged with since the global financial crisis. First, it will include multiple scenarios to capture both transition and physical risks. The broad profiles of these scenarios are set out on this next slide. Let me start with the purple lines, which describe a no additional policy actions scenario. And here, as the name suggests, no policy actions beyond those which have already been announced are delivered. So the transition here is insufficient for the world to meet Paris goals. This is a case where physical risks would be maximised. Then we have the benign early policy action scenario, which is set out in blue lines on this chart. This is where we see immediate concerted effort from governments worldwide to implement Paris-consistent climate policies, resulting in as close as we can get to a smooth transition. Of course, the far more likely scenario is the late policy action case shown in the orange lines on the slide. Here, the idea is that governments delay action for several further years, but then embark on a cold turkey approach to decarbonisation when the urgency of the situation cannot be delayed further. I think this is the most interesting of the scenarios considered. It delivers maximum transition risk as countries slam on the brakes, and we'd expect to see large falls in asset valuations, accompanied by an economic contraction as societies grapple with structural change. Some other features of the proposed scenario that I think are worth highlighting. Firstly, it will be a joint test of both bank and insurer balance sheets. It's something the Bank of England hasn't done previously, and other central banks haven't either. And it will allow the bank to look at possible interactions between these two sectors in potentially amplifying the risks. The horizon being modelled will also run out 30 years, so a much longer horizon than is common in stress testing. The bank will seek to provide integrated climate and macro financial variables, something, again, that will be a big challenge for the bank, but it's a key contribution of the exercise. And the bank's expectation is that participating firms will run counterparty level analysis. That means banks assessing the viability of the business models of the individual companies they lend to. The expectation is that will occur for the vast majority of the balance sheets. And needless to say, this is an extremely tricky exercise to pull off well. And I think the first attempts will really be best viewed as like the first on a sequence of many in this area. It's tricky for the following reasons. So central banks have almost no experience in building scenarios with climate's macro links. As I said, part of the aim here is developing their capacity to do so in future. There are also technical questions about how to run an exercise with a 30-year horizon, given that most firms will have no experience projecting their balance sheets this far out. At the same time, even a 30-year horizon won't be sufficient to capture some of the physical risks that we expect to transpire later this century. There are subtle questions around how much information to provide to firms via the scenarios. More information means more consistent results. The risk of kind of crowding out information about what firms expect themselves to happen. And more fundamentally, I think there are questions about how far out in the tail to position these scenarios. Should they be severe but plausible, i.e. kind of really tail outcomes, or should they be closer to a prudent best guess? maybe these are thoughts we can come back to in the discussion. Let me end by saying a few words about central banks' wider role in the transition. And the first point I'd like to make here is that while these stress tests will be extremely useful, they shouldn't be viewed as a surrogate for higher carbon taxes. By themselves, they won't correct the risk pricing anomaly I described at the beginning. The first generation of these tests have explicitly ruled out a link to regulatory capital. And institution-specific results won't be published. So these won't result in a direct financial impact for firms. Central banks do, however, have other possible tools at their disposal. We're seeing efforts underway to improve climate-related disclosures. I'd view this as a necessary condition to address the risk pricing issue. Central banks could also adjust their bank capital frameworks by raising the risk weights on brown assets. That's something that's been discussed a lot. And they could exclude fossil fuel assets from future bond purchases or from their collateral frameworks on the monetary policy side. So these tools are available. And I think there are two questions we could perhaps return to in the discussion here. So first, to what extent are such measures within the remits of central banks? And secondly, how effective would we think they'd be? Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David, for that interesting introduction. So you should just be on camera again now and unmute your microphone so that we can have a tiny chat with you. There you are. Nice to see you again. You ended your presentation by asking a question. How effective will it be? So what is your view on that? How effective can it be? Oh, we don't have any sound, David. So hang on a second. We'll see if you are maybe. Oh, there you are. So yeah, you can start all over again, please.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, I left the presentation with two questions. One about, are these issues within the remits of central banks? I mean, my answer to that question would be yes, if you kind of interpret the mandates of central banks sufficiently broadly. So most central banks have like a primary mandate to do with price stability or financial stability. And there's usually then a secondary mandate that says you should support the economic policies of the government. I think, obviously supporting a sustainable growth trajectory for the economy is within that, I would argue. On the question of effectiveness, I must admit, I'm a little bit skeptical that the measures that I outline on my slide would do a great deal, if I'm being frank. So the two specific measures I mentioned were we could increase risk weights for banks. Basically, this is the amount of capital they need to hold when they're financing different assets. If a country unilaterally tried to increase risk weights, these markets are very, very international, and what would happen is large companies would just be able to borrow from other jurisdictions. So it would require a multilateral approach. This is why the work of the Basel Committee is quite important here. More generally, though, these companies have a load of different sources of finance they can access. Increased risk weights affect bank finance, but they can also issue bonds in capital markets, and those other types of finance wouldn't be subject to the requirements. So this is an area that's a little bit tricky.
It is, but is this happening to a certain extent now that central banks are actually, using their financial muscle in order to move a transition in either one or another direction? Do you see any signs of that now?
And for me, it's more a signal about the direction that society wants to go. So I think if central banks come out and say, first of all, we want the financial system to stress test against these risks, that's a big signal to financial institutions to take this seriously. It's also kind of, you could view it as supporting wider government efforts to support a transition. My honest view is to actually make this happen, it will require some government action to tilt incentives in the financial sector much more towards green assets, and that does mean kind of either it effectively means higher carbon prices, I think. And so I view then central banks' efforts as kind of supporting that rather than the driving force.
Now, David, I'm going to stop you for a second there, because today we have, as I mentioned earlier, a small panel of experts who are going to help me out asking questions to the presenters. Often these do have slightly different perspectives in their questions. And today's experts, they are two in the number. They are both from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Trondheim, the NTNU. The first one is Asgeir Tomasgard, the director of the Energy Transition Initiative at the university, and he's also our host here today. And he's also a professor in economics and optimization, doing research on energy transition, strategies and energy policy. I'm going to mention the second expert, though we're not going to meet him quite yet. That's Tomas Moe Skjølsvold, and he too is a professor at the NTNU, and he's conducting research in the interface between technology and social science, having, amongst others, studied Norwegian transitional strategies towards a green energy system. So today I'm going to let one expert ask one presenter a question. Well, each presenter one question or two, so that we have some time for the larger discussion later on. And I think, Asgeir, I can see that you're already on camera. Do you have a question ready for David?
So thank you, and thank you first for a very interesting presentation. I think it's highly interesting to see and learn about how financial institutions are preparing to understand better the risks that we are exposed to in a changing environment. And as I understand you, there has been a very high focus on stress testing how well portfolios can cope with the climate effects of climate change and also the physical effects of climate change. And I think, as you say, that will already drive investments somehow in the right direction if transition is the purpose. But if you look at this, you also mentioned that this will also obviously change business models of companies, and it will change maybe as a consequence of climate change, but also as a consequence of consumers' preferences linked to climate change, and also to the technology switches that we will have as a consequence of the energy transition, for example, fuel switching and phasing out some technologies. So I'm wondering, this must also be very much related to what I would call market risk, where at one point the market prices highly in terms of risk rates some of the investments that earlier have been quite profitable. And at one point, well, I guess that it's easy to see that, for example, Norway as a petroleum heavy country, if you look traditionally, countries have tended to overinvest in technologies that has been very successful, and then you have disruptive changes. So in which way does large financial institutions handle this market risk of being overinvested and locked into technologies on the way out?
That's a really prescient question, I think. Economists tend to use the word, or this word, Minsky moments has kind of entered the lexicon of economists to describe what you're talking about. So this idea that, you know, at one moment people view the future as rosy and asset valuations are consistent with that, and then there's suddenly an abrupt change in expectations in a way that's very hard to predict ex ante, but we do know that these things can happen. And, you know, what looked like a valuable asset at one stage can suddenly change dramatically. So I would say kind of testing for market risk is like one of the fundamental things that central banks do with their capital framework. So that's not like a new risk in any way. What is new is the kind of climate dimension to that, and understanding which assets will reprice most heavily. You know, we obviously have we can have a good guess of the assets that will be most directly at risk. You know, anything that has a kind of a high carbon element to it. I think what's harder is trying to understand the second round effect. So exactly as you said, you know, this process will trigger large changes in our societies, and that's that will have second round effects that can be very hard to actually gauge ex ante. So this is where the kind of art in stress testing lies. I think there's no kind of, you can't rely on history to kind of understand how, the scale of these risks. It has to be more forward-looking judgments about, which sectors may be most at risk. There is an approach that I like, sometimes goes under the name of reverse stress testing, where you ask a financial firm, what is it that would cause the most trouble for you? So rather than trying to second guess what will happen, what will go wrong, you kind of put the question to them. And I think that can be a useful approach in dealing with what you say.
Thank you, both of you, for this, the question and your good answer, David. We have to move forward, but there are two questions in Slido, and I would like to ask one of them now and maybe save the second one for later. And you have to answer really shortly because we have to move on. How is the alternative of reduced growth, economic and/or population, so demographically, included in future economic models?
Ooh.
Is it included at all?
It's not. It's the short one.
Maybe it should be.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think kind of, this view, that idea that we do need to kind of stop growth, for me is viewed on a slightly old-fashioned way of understanding the growth process in our economy. Growth will be more about the services sector, intangibles. It doesn't require natural resource use, I would argue. There's a short answer for you. So
growth is always going to be on the table. Great. Well, thank you so much this far, David. We're going to meet you again later on. So for the large discussion and the panel that we're going to have. And thanks also to Asgeir. So now we say goodbye to David for the moment. Now let's travel into the digital sphere to explore to what extent that sector is changing the game. We are, after all, living in the midst of the fourth industrial revolution, the digital one, where the technology development happens so fast that we're struggling to keep up. How can digital technology help the energy transition forward? Someone who is well positioned to give us insightful answers to that is Hege Skryseth. She is the CEO of Kongsberg Digital, a provider of software and digital solutions to the maritime and the oil and gas industries. She is ready to answer your questions after her presentation, so please post your comments on Slido, and you can look into the chat and see the correct URL. It's slide.do, and the code is still ET Gamechangers. But first, Hege is inviting us on a virtual journey into the land of digital twins. So just buckle up and get ready to join Hege Skryseth.
Hello everyone, my name is Hege Skryseth. I'm the CEO of Kongsberg Digital. Today I'm going to talk about transformation of the energy industry, one of the most important industries in the world. Kongsberg Digital was established back in 2016. We were set off to contribute and transform two of the leading industries in the world, the maritime industry and also the energy industry overall. So today I'm going to give you an example of a technology that has significant impact and have the power within the technology and the transformational processes around it to transform the energy industry for the years to come. Now we're going to have a look at a demo, but first I just want to take you into the context of the digital twin. So from a technology standpoint, it's really a virtual representation of a physical asset, and it also takes into consideration all of the various processes, the data that's collected across the various sensors, and also physical models to map out everything that's ongoing on an asset. And let's now have a look at Oseberg H at the Norwegian continental shelf. So here we are flying in over the Norwegian continental shelf, and what you soon will be seeing is a full representation of the asset itself. And of course, given that this is an unmanned asset, it's very important to also have a full overview of the surroundings. So everything you see here is in real time, meaning that the sea model is in real time. You will also see surrounding vessels, as we are looking at here now, where we have the AIS data, so that we are able to identify the vessel, what type of vessel, what type of cargo, what's the relation to the platform, etc., which is important not only from logistics standpoint, but also from a security standpoint. And as we now are flying back to the platform again, we can go in and look at all of the various components on board the platform. We can zoom in to different components, and with the use of the physical models, we also have an opportunity to identify if there's any issues that we need to look into, meaning that we do a comparison in between the simulator and the actual state and the wanted state of the various components. As you can see, we have also connected this to PNIDs. Meaning that that's a dynamic connection, meaning any changes on the PNIDs also reflect the asset itself. So any changes or any updates to the PNIDs will also impact directly the virtual model, the digital twin. We can do all types of measures. We could also incorporate CCTV, as you see an example of here. We can train machine learning algorithms based on the physical models and apply those for increased production, etc. So there's a number of capabilities within a twin like this that the operator can take advantage of. If you are focused on the production part, you can also then extrapolate only the visualization that's of interest, and you can go in and look if there's any issues in any of the risers, and you can even use the physical model then to look into the more details on the process to see what to accommodate when it comes to managing the task. So what we see here is really that we have a challenge. We have to infuse some more gas into the riser due to the pressure point in the riser. So this was a short demonstration of the basic functionality in a digital twin, and we will now go on and show you a couple of use cases on how you can use applications on top of the digital twin. And now I'm going to introduce you to a use case on compressors and energy optimizer. So the optimizer is now running, and what we can see here is a simplified schematics of the process model. Behind this we have a fully dynamic process model representing the whole system. It is possible to spin up as many instances of the model as you require. Here we are showing 4 in parallel. These physical models represent the behavior of the system, and we can test different scenarios to see what changes provide the best improvement. So first one is running on the current online conditions. Number 2 is predicting how it will look into the future. And the number 1 optimization, looking at how we can reduce seawater, lift pump, power consumption. And number 2 here is a bit more complex, looking at how set points in the plant can be altered. So I now want you to keep an eye on the total power consumption here and the total gas export, as you can also see visualized in the 2 graphs here. Of course, gas is valuable, so we try to keep the production as high as possible at the same time while lowering the power consumption. And now we're going to look at a different use case that is simultaneous operation and permit to work. Overall, the main cause of all incidents in the oil and gas industry is equipment failure, followed by human error. The majority of these incidents occurred during production operations. With increased visibility and production operations, these incidents can be significantly reduced. Okay, here we can see our digital twin for the Nyhamna gas plant for Shell, the technical service provider of the facility. This is an updated dynamic twin where we can see every detail in 3D for many benefits. Let's say that I'm a worker at the gas plant and want to do some specific type of work on a specific day. How would I know that there are no other conflicting work happening on that day in the same area? In order to do a proper, safe job analysis, traditionally this would have been an extensive process. But with our new digital twin application, SimOps, Simultaneous Operations and Perimeter Work, you can easily, for any given date, quickly visualize what is happening on the plant for that day, as you can see in the top right corner here. This was just a few examples on how the digital twin technology can be applied on an asset and an operation. Analyst firms are projecting that this could save operators 30% on CapEx and up to 50% on OpEx, and also the likelihood of increasing production 10 to 15%. This is also confirmed by large operators where they see this as a very strong technology to actually transform the way they are working. And of course, with an ease of use user interface that we have seen now, it's also an opportunity to ensure that all of the different expert functions are able to work together and work on the same user interface. It also allows non-expert users to get a full overview of what's going on in the different production assets. So hopefully this was of value, and as I mentioned, it was only a sneak peek into some of the functionality a digital twin can offer, and thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much, Hege, for that interesting insight into the digital twins. And now I would like you to come back on camera. There you are. Hello again.
Hello, hello.
So I was wondering, Hege, because now you showed us some examples of how the oil and gas industry are performing better in many ways, both enhancing production, lowering the costs, probably using less energy as well, and you know, increasing their production. But if we're looking into the energy transition and maybe towards a more renewable energy system, how can these technologies, for instance, the digital twins, be used in that sense from the renewable sector?
I think there's many transitions going on at the same time here. So basically, we are transitioning with technology for the brownfields. We are setting up greenfields in a different manner. We are able to significantly reduce emissions when it comes to, of course, the safety of the platforms, but also on energy consumption. And I think this technology could easily be applied also to other energy sources.
Okay. And if I understood you correctly, what you're actually doing in the digital twin is to sort of combine well-known technologies and data. It was like BIM, you had 3D data, you mentioned AIS, etc. So it's all about understanding how to use the technology which is already there. Do you feel that you know, the different actors in the energy sector are good enough in taking this into new uses?
I think there's a lot of curiosity around new technology, but I still think that it's not fully connected to how you transform your organization to adapt to sort of the new opportunities that the technology allows you. Because the technology is there, so it's all about how you use it and how you apply it, and how you also change your work processes to fully accommodate the opportunities.
Precisely. So, as you saw with David, our first speaker, we had this expert panel asking questions. Now, I'm crossing my fingers because I know that Thomas had some sound issues earlier, but I'm crossing my fingers that he's ready to ask you a question. So, Thomas, are you there? Yeah, I can see you there. Can you hear us as well? You're smiling, so you're probably hearing us.
I can hear you.
Perfect. So, what would you like to interrogate Hege with?
Yeah, I would actually like to press a little bit further on what you started with, Ruth, because this is extremely fascinating, of course, digital twins and this entire sort of model duplicate world that is emerging across multiple fields. It's used in the sectors you talked about here, but also in other sites. And that can be a really powerful, useful tool for transforming operations, as you said. But on the other hand, the kind of more cynical take on this is that, well, we have huge, powerful actors such as you guys in this situation, in constellations with oil and gas actors in this situation, building even more powerful technologies, more investments, putting more effort into kind of building synergies around essentially a carbon-based economy. And you sort of dodged it by saying that this can easily be applied to other technologies, but that is a bit of a trick answer, because most things can be applied to other sectors, but there's, you know, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So it's then a matter of which are your companies and your associates' strategies for sort of pushing in that direction in terms of pushing maybe oil and gas into renewable ventures, into sort of making broader transformations, not only within the oil and gas industry, which is important, but more broader in society as such, so that we do not only incrementally move slowly towards not really meeting our climate targets, but radically and game-changingly move in, you know, fundamentally transformative direction as a society. So.
Big question.
I think, as I said in my last answer, is that I think there's many transitions going on at the same time here, and I think the dependency in the world still, when it comes to oil, is going to be there for a while. So the opportunity that this allows for a safe operation and also significant reduce in energy consumption is still going to be there. Then it comes to gas. We have a tendency to say oil and gas in the same sentence, and I think that gas is going to be a dependency in the world for a long time. We also have developed the same technology for grids, and that is really to be able to do the balancing and flexibility within the grid to accommodate the electrification that's happening without having to build a monster mass and all of the other infrastructure part of that. So we are somewhere in both areas, I would say. So it's I think it's important to ensure that the new technology also is accommodating the existing establishments. And I think it's quite easily transferred. And what I said about the grids, it's really the same technology, just applied for grid.
So we'll just have to see then what happens. And I understood, Thomas, that he wanted you to sort of push forward even harder and more actively in that effort to transform this. You heard it. So yeah, you're going to do that. Oh, that's good. That's good.
Okay.
Hege, just a point, and I'm sorry, Thomas, I know that you probably would like to discuss more, but you're going to have the chance to do that later on. One quick question from the audience, Hege. Most of the emissions from the oil and gas industry come from power generation and flaring. How can digital twins help reduce these emissions? Or can they?
What we see is that there's quite high ambitions on the energy consumption part from many operators. And if we look at the NIANA that I presented here, if they reduce the energy consumption by 1%, it equals 11,000 households. And that's Norwegian households, meaning we use a lot of heating, etc. during the winter time. So there's many options and opportunities in there, I think.
So we're going to get back to you later on, Hege. Thank you for now, and we'll see you again for the discussion, so people can still ask questions to you and the others. Now, technology matters, that's for sure, but what about people? Us, you and me. Shouldn't we contribute to the change too, as conscious consumers or as active citizens? And if we did, would it matter at all? Jim Watson, Professor of Energy Policy and Research Director at the Institute of Sustainable Resources at the University College London, will soon examine people's potential influence and impact in this regard, and in particular through the concept of climate assemblies. If we're lucky, we might get some fresh out of the press news from the UK about the public opinion on how COVID-19 stimulus packages should be seen and used in relation to carbon neutrality. Are people linking these together or not? I hope you're all ready for another trip over to the UK, and although he's working in London, I know that Jim Watson is currently located in Brighton, where he has been stuck for the last 3 months. We are going to join him there. Jim Watson, the digital floor is yours. Take it away.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Jim Watson. I'm Professor of Energy Policy at the UCL Institute for Sustainable Resources, and I'm going to speak about the role of people in the energy transition. This relates to the theme of this seminar, this webinar on game changers, I think in 2 different ways. One is that achieving cuts in emissions required for the energy transition really means people engaging with energy in many different ways and really changing that relationship with energy use and lifestyles more broadly. The second way is that because of the far-reaching nature of some of these changes required, there is really a change happening in terms of how people are being asked to engage, away from their traditional role as consumers of products or the way in which they use particular technologies, through to acting more as citizens and being active in the debate about exactly how we're going to achieve our ambitious targets for emissions reduction and meeting other policy goals. So to start with, many of our discussions about transitions to net zero emissions, certainly in the UK where I am, and probably in many other countries too, often get talked about in terms of the technologies that require to be rolled out, often very rapidly in order to reduce emissions quickly. So everything from electricity generation technologies through renewable sources through to measures to upgrade our buildings or to build better new buildings, ways of heating our homes and offices that are low carbon, new types of low carbon transport such as electric vehicles, and then changes to industrial production, which are illustrated in the bottom right of this slide. And even for many countries and globally as well, deploying technologies that actually remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. In this case, I've illustrated it at the top right with direct air capture. The interesting thing, and I haven't really done this deliberately, is that most of these pictures have absolutely no people in them at all, or if they're there, they're very hard to spot. But actually, if we want to achieve this kind of transition, it really does mean asking people to behave in very different ways, to adopt new technologies, or to pay for technologies that are being deployed elsewhere. So just to frame this discussion, I'm first going to talk about a general mapping of the different roles people can play, taking you beyond this traditional way of talking about people as consumers. And then secondly, I'm going to talk about one of those roles as citizens in a little bit more detail with a couple of examples. So first, this map, this comes from some colleagues from a centre I used to direct called the UK Energy Research Centre in the UK, colleagues from the University of East Anglia. They did a survey, a systematic review of different ways in which people are engaging with the energy system in the UK. They found a lot of examples and they mapped them according to one, whether the engagement was about specific actions or broader issues. So that's on the vertical axis here, and also according to who is organising the engagement. Is it led by institutions like government or companies on the left, or is it actually organised by citizens themselves in a more bottom-up manner? And that's on the right. So within that, there are the 4 quadrants you can see on the slide. The bottom left, an example might be a living lab. There are many of these. This example by a government research and innovation agency in the UK has 100 homes and invites companies to trial new technologies to test how they might work in a real world environment. So in other words, with homes where people live. So that's an example of a more consumer oriented view of people's engagement with the energy transition. If we move from left to right at the bottom, we get to more citizen-led examples, and maybe more collective examples, such as energy cooperatives and community energy groups. An example I've given here is the Brighton Energy Cooperative, which was founded a few years ago where I live in the south of England, and that allows people to invest, for example, in solar projects on schools or other commercial and public buildings. So more collective type of action, perhaps, in that quadrant. Then if we move up to the top right, so this is citizen-led, but actually focusing on the issues, this is where a lot of the activism might fit in this particular picture. So, for example, all the protests we saw led by groups like Extinction Rebellion last year, and others beyond that as well in the UK and other countries, which have had an effect on raising awareness, but also in terms of encouraging governments to act as well in some cases. And then finally, if we move across to the top left, we get to more institutional-led, more organized ways of getting citizens to talk about the issues associated with the energy transition. So that, for example, you would have consultations, opinion surveys, or deliberative processes, which are a bit more detailed. And that's where I'm going to focus for the rest of my remarks in this talk. And I'm going to use the example here of Climate Assembly UK, which is a UK national citizens' assembly on climate change. So citizens' assemblies are now being used for many different topics in different countries to get citizens involved in thinking about how to tackle them. Often they're quite thorny, difficult topics to address. On the slide, I've got 2 examples. On the left is the Climate Assembly UK, the National Citizens Assembly in the UK, which I'm involved in as one of 4 expert advisors. As you'll see by the slides, like many activities, it had to move online in April this year. So a lot of its deliberation has been done online as well as in person. And then on the right-hand side, a timeline from the French Citizens Assembly, which is just concluding and reporting its findings to the French president. So in France, there's a slightly different process there underway. So a little bit more information over the last few slides about Climate Assembly UK. What is it and how does it work first? It was commissioned by 6 committees from the UK Parliament, so not by government, but by the Parliament itself. And it was asked to consider how the UK should meet its target of meeting net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So that's the UK's official target. It has 108 members. They are representative of the UK population in terms of age, gender, education, ethnicity, where they live, in terms of urban-rural split, for example, and they're spread around the country, and also their attitudes to climate change. So their attitude to climate change is again representative of the spread of those attitudes in the general population. It met for 3 weekends between January and March 2020, and then because of the impact of coronavirus, the Assembly has moved online, and so it's had 3 online weekends between April and May this year. Its deliberations have involved 3 phases. One is about learning about the topic, lots of evidence and input from experts and other presenters to the Assembly. Second, deliberation, that's lots of time for the members to discuss what they've heard from the experts and the other organisations and what do they think about it. And third, decision making, voting, but also making a lot of very nuanced and detailed points about what they think about particular options and about what government and other actors should do to help us meet our target. It has a lot of advisory structures around it, expert leads like me, an advisory panel, which includes stakeholders, and an academic panel. And that is all to ensure that the Assembly receives accurate, balanced and comprehensive information to help it make decisions. So just to finish off, I can't give you any detailed results from the Assembly. Most of the results are not going to be published until September this year, but you're lucky that they've just published some interim results about the impact of COVID-19 and the potential link between that and economic recovery and the path to net zero. And the Assembly members were asked 2 questions, which I've got results for on the next couple of slides, and also some comments about what they said about those issues. So first, the proposition was that the steps taken by government to help the economy recover should be designed to help net zero. So they voted on that proposition. And as you can see from here, there's very strong agreement that that should be the case. But also, as with all of the votes at the Assembly, they had a lot of rich discussions, and so the comments around that were also captured. And here are some of the things that people talked about. The comments in bold are more commonly came up in discussions. The ones not in bold came up less. So, for example, limiting or putting conditions on investment in high carbon industries was discussed a lot, such as airlines. Rethinking and investing in infrastructure, so we're prioritizing infrastructure that is needed for net zero or low carbon economy, supporting low carbon industries and jobs, and really linking that to economic opportunity. So as we tackle COVID-19 and its economic impact, there's a real effort to think about where the new jobs might be created to tackle climate change. So that's the first vote. The second one is, as lockdown eases, government, employers and others should take steps to encourage lifestyles to change to be more compatible with reaching net zero. Again, very strong agreement on that. So the Assembly members felt that, yes, government, employers and others should encourage people to change their lifestyles. Very few Assembly members disagreed. Again, here's a list of the kind of issues people raised. Not surprisingly, again, the ones in bold were raised more often. There were a lot of comments about encouraging home working, given that many people had to work from home because of the impact of the pandemic, and also encouraging changes to how we travel. So some of those changes people have had to make, traveling less, certainly flying less, but also traveling less in other ways, and maybe shifting the way they travel towards cycling to public transport and so on. So really taking that opportunity to change. And then there are a whole set of other considerations which were also raised as well, including a link back to green industry and job creation as well. So that's where I'm going to leave it. That was a very brief overview of some results that have just come out from the UK Climate Assembly, but really is an illustration of some of that deeper engagement with the transition to net zero or to low carbon energy systems that now is being enabled by these deliberative processes. So we're no longer thinking of people just as consumers and as people who have to change their lifestyles, but actually people who have a say in the overall direction of the transition, how it gets paid for, and who should do what. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Jim, for that interesting presentation and also for sharing extremely fresh results, actually, because I think these results from the interim are published today. Isn't that right?
Yeah, you're very lucky. They came out just this morning. Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks a lot. And I was thinking you've got more than 20 years of research experience on climate change and energy and innovation policy. And is this, I would like to call it the public awakening that we see now, is that something new and substantial? I mean, do you believe that it's going to have true impact this time? Because I don't think we've seen that before that much, have we?
I think it's not new, but I think the level of awareness and the level of debate in the public is much higher than it was before. And that is actually, I mean, certainly sitting in the UK and for other countries, sitting in a country where not only are we having to deal with the coronavirus, but that we've been obsessed by this thing called Brexit over the last few years as well. And it's cut through both of those. I mean, that's the remarkable thing, is this whole discussion about how urgent climate action has cut through, and it's led to real policy change, at least at the high level of more ambitious targets. Really, for me, the question is that then going to filter through into all of the detailed things that need to be done to actually meet those targets, not just in 2050, but actually in the medium term, you know, the next few years. But yes, I think it has changed. Pardon? What do I
Sorry,
think?
what do you think then? Yeah, what do you think then?
I oscillate between optimism and pessimism. I think, as the assembly results showed, there is a real appetite to link what everybody's thinking about, which is economic recovery right now, to climate action. There's a lot of glib slogans flying around from politicians and industry leaders, things like Build Back Better, fine, I agree. But okay, I want to see the next 2 levels of detail, please. How exactly are you going to mobilize an army of people to upgrade our poor housing in the UK? How are you going to persuade people who are actually got less money than they had 3 months ago to start buying electric cars more quickly? So, it's that level of detail we really need to see. There's rumours that the UK government's going to publish some of that, and other governments too. But, that's the bit that makes me pause and be less optimistic until I really see what the plans are.
Well, we're going to discuss that with the rest of the speakers later on, because I think this is a very interesting perspective and an important one as well. But now I would like to invite our expert Thomas back on stage. I'm pretty certain he has some interesting perspectives to ask you about. Thomas.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate this perspective, and I of course kind of sympathize, coming from a very similar background and approach to what you're doing. So I think my challenge to you wouldn't, in a sense, necessarily be about what you just presented, but it could be a sort of a speculation that I would want you to embark on. The first half of your presentation consisted of sort of different ways that people can engage with the energy transition, energy system, technologies, and so on and so forth. And I guess there is a tendency to think about them in very limited ways and related to relatively few types of policy actions, policy choices. So within the kind of Norwegian context, where a lot of the debate now is, so there's EVs that you mentioned, but it's a lot of big tech, carbon capture and storage, it's wind technology, offshore wind, and so on and so forth. And there is a tendency to think, is my suspicion, that part of this big tech focus is because many people believe that they can do that without engaging the publics. So can you credibly tell them otherwise? Yeah, why do we need to engage them also in these big overarching large technology developments that we're so keen on pushing?
Yeah, I think you're right, and actually UK and Norway are quite similar in that way, is that there is a tendency here too to think about the big, partly because we've been successful with offshore wind, and we're a smaller oil and gas producer than Norway, but we still are one, and so CCS is quite prominent in our discussion too. Quite rightly in my view. I don't think you can do those without the consent. I mean, you could do them for a while, but they are going to require, either through taxes or bills, people to subsidize them. Less so offshore wind these days, but CCS is going to need whacking great subsidies of some sort to get it going. Somebody's got to pay. Now, the government can try and do that stealthily, but eventually it will come out, and then there'll be a debate. Now, if the debate is happened first, and we say, well, actually, these are perhaps going to be needed for heating, for industry, for negative emissions, and here's a conversation about it, here's what it's going to cost, and you get people involved at that stage, I think you're much less likely to get that backlash later on when people discover they've suddenly paid a lot of money for these things. And also, there's a lot of disquiet, if you look at the data from opinion polling and from things like deliberative processes about things like CCS. There's a very equivocal view about them because they still use fossil fuels, and it's seen as something which doesn't, in quotes, solve the problem fully. So I think on that one, I think that family of technology is particularly vulnerable to public backlashes if it isn't handled right. But I think it needs to be handled right.
Thanks.
Good. Thank you. We have to move forward, gentlemen. I'm sorry to say, but fortunately, we're going to meet both of you later on. So thank you so much, Jim, for this so far. Now that we've penciled out the broader picture, let's look more closely into some concrete sectors, such as agriculture. We know that emissions from the agricultural sector account for somewhere between 10 to 15% of the global emissions, depending on what statistics you look at. At Yara, a world-leading fertilizer company with Norwegian roots, they are continuously working to reduce their carbon footprint, and their ambition is to become climate neutral by 2050. Now, they are seeing results in this work, and we are now going to meet Yara's Vice President of Climate Neutral Solutions, Sammy Van Den Broeck, who claims that sustainable value chains in agriculture can facilitate the energy transition. I'm curious to find out or to learn how, and if you get curious too, don't hesitate to send in your questions through Slido and to like those who are already there. There's still room for more questions, and the code is still ET Gamechangers, and you can check out the URL on the chat in GoToWebinar as well. Now, let's lend an ear to Sammy Van Den Broeck. Here we go.
Good morning. My name is Sammy Van Den Broeck. I'm the Vice President for Climate Neutral Solutions in Yara. And today I will talk about how sustainable value chains in agriculture can facilitate the energy transition. Yara is a leading provider of crop nutrition solutions, reaching out to more than 20 million farmers worldwide. What less people know about us is that we're also one of the world's largest hydrogen producers. Yara has reduced its emissions the last 15 years by more than 50%, mainly by cutting N2O emissions in the nitric acid production. We are targeting another reduction of 10% by 2025 and have the clear ambition to become climate neutral by 2050. To become climate neutral, a key focus are the emissions in our production system, about 16 million tons or 23% of the total within our scope. We also work on solutions for our logistical and raw material supply. An example is Yara Birkeland, the first autonomous electrical container vessel that we have in the pipeline. And then we see that basically we also need to work together with our customers, with the farmers, to reduce the in-field emissions, which account for 58% of the emissions in our scope today. When we look at our production system, traditionally we produce nitrogen fertilizer by extracting nitrogen from the air and recombining it with hydrogen into ammonia as a building block for all nitrogenous fertilizers. The hydrogen we extract from natural gas, a fossil source today, but in the future we aim to replace part of the natural gas by renewable energy and water by a process called electrolysis. And this process is not unfamiliar, as Yara used it until 1991 in several facilities to produce green ammonia from green hydrogen at a large scale, up to 155 megawatts. So if technology can build on almost a century of history, where lies the main challenge? As you can see from this graph from the International Energy Agency, traditional ammonia production based on natural gas emits about 2 tons of CO2 per ton of ammonia. This can be reduced to nearly zero by deploying carbon capture and storage, electrolysis, or biomass-based hydrogen. When we look at the color charts, the costs, then we see that long-term biomass will remain an extremely expensive solution, while, for example, electrolysis has the potential to become more or less cost parity with natural gas in the future. However, if we look at the situation today with the current renewable energy prices and the current costs for electrolysis projects, we are still in the gray zone, where basically green ammonia has a production cost which is 3 to 5 times higher than the current market prices for ammonia. And that is, of course, a challenge. A challenge that farmer and industry cannot carry on their own. There is definitely a need for further reduction and availability of renewable energy prices and renewable energy. there is a clear need for support and flagship projects, a call which seems to be responded now, for example, by the German hydrogen strategy, by the new EU Innovation Fund, and by initiatives in Norway and the Netherlands, for example. And what we see is that on top of that, we definitely need the value chain, the food value chain, and the customer to be part of the equation to ensure that the whole world of agriculture can be part of the energy transition and increase its performance even more when it comes to sustainability. As Yara, we want to walk the talk, so we have started on some commercial demonstration projects, one in the south of Norway at our facility in Porsgrunn, Herøya, where we want to put in use the next generation of Nel electrolyzers, striving for more energy efficiency. And we do have a project in Australia as well, where we want to look further into intermittent renewable power as input to electrolysis and ammonia production through Haber-Bosch synthesis. But as said, to be fully sustainable, we need to look across the full value chain. What you see in the picture is a typical emission profile that leads to the production of bread in Europe. And we see that there are quite significant emissions associated with the production of fertilizer and other ag inputs. We see that quite a few emissions are related to the use of the arable land and the inputs. And then we see fragmented sources of CO2 or greenhouse gases basically in the supply chain, the food processing, and so forth. So as Yara, we really work on providing green nutrients, which has to come as part of the energy transition. We put a lot of research into enabling farmers to improve nitrogen use efficiency and reduction of in-field N2O through scientific strategies and tools. And then we count on the food chain to ensure basically that on the shelf of the supermarket, we can have food with the lowest possible carbon footprint. Again, we try to walk the talk and have a cooperation with Svenska Lantmännen, a Swedish food chain company and agricultural giant, to work towards the world's first fossil-free food value chain. So as we see it as Yara, knowledge and science, together with digitalization and the right product portfolio, needs to be brought as one crop nutrition solution to the farmer in order for him to improve his yield, which is in most cases, and if done right, much better for the environment, to improve the quality of the food so that we get less food waste, and to basically improve sustainability, reducing the emissions associated to agricultural inputs and also to in-field emissions on arable lands. And to enable the farmer to implement such solutions, we are fully conscious that distributors and especially food chain companies will play a key role, because we need to bring the zero carbon footprint to the food consumer, you and me, buying our food at the local stores or in the supermarkets. Just one example of that, Yara aims to bring the science at the fingertip of the farmers in the most simplified way, enabling him to apply nitrogen where it's needed, when it's needed, and even field specific and specific for subparts of the field. And this all is assisted, for example, by satellite technology, so that the technology can become available for every farmer, and that he can use these maps to fertilize variably across one field, even if it doesn't have a variable spreader. And by developing such tools, we want to create, also together with the scientific community, strong models and engines, so that this type of tools with knowledge at the fingertips can also help farmers reduce their emissions from their fields. Another example is our work with IBM Food Trust to ensure that all the knowledge, science, data from farm and field can be reaching the shelves in the supermarket or the local store through, for example, open exchange data platforms and blockchain technology. Last but not least, we don't only see opportunities for the fertilizer and green ammonia. We see that green ammonia has also a very high potential as probably the best zero carbon shipping fuel. A bit counterintuitively, green ammonia is in many aspects a better hydrogen carrier than hydrogen in itself. It has a higher density, volumetric energy density. It can be transported at -33 degrees centigrade instead of -253 for hydrogen, and quite a lot of the infrastructure already exists. So we see a lot of synergies here between sustainable agriculture and sustainable shipping as well, united through the molecule called green ammonia. So in short, Yara wants to take up the glove to be part and proactively part of the energy transition, but we'll have to have a holistic value chain approach, basically from factory to farm, from farm to fork, to ensure that the consumer is fully part of creating sustainable agriculture. Alone we can do so little, together we can do so much. Thank you very much. We will now open up the floor for questions, I believe.
You're absolutely right, Sam. We are going to open up the floor for questions, and thank you so much for those perspectives. And also, it's interesting to see how you at Yara see new possibilities and entering completely new markets. You mentioned shipping, but I was just wondering, can you, I can see you well, and I guess you can hear me as well. You're smiling and nodding, that's a good sign. Just out of curiosity, because I don't think you mentioned the reason why, but you said that you were producing green ammonia until 1991, and then you stopped doing that. Why did that happen? Oh, we can't hear you, so hang on.
Yeah, okay. Now it should be fine, I think. Yes, thanks for your question. I think the reason why, in a way, the green ammonia production was stopped roughly 30 years ago was at that time a simple economics, basically. Natural gas-based production turned out to be a much cheaper solution to produce hydrogen and fertilizer than electricity, basically, even in the Norwegian context, which is already particular by itself. Yeah.
Yes, I imagine that could be the reason why you stopped it. And also, I would like, when it comes to costs, you described that producing ammonia, green ammonia, is expensive. Do you feel in Yara that the farmers are ready to take part of that cost in order to go greener in their production?
Well, what we see is there indeed the importance of the value chain, right? So for the farmer, he cannot carry this alone. If he doesn't have a customer paying for the delta in cost, it will not work even if he wants it to. But we always use, in a way, the simple example that if you would go and buy a loaf of bread, and it would be produced based on green fertilizer, basically, that might be only a few cents more, euro cents, that is more expensive than traditional bread. So almost you and me, like in the previous presentation, would be prepared to pay that immediately. But the reality is that there is a long value chain in between, in a way, the production of agricultural inputs, because that goes via distributors to retailers, farmers who sell their produce, which ultimately comes in the hands of food companies and food processors who then sell it basically into a retail and supermarket chain. And in a way, that extra cost needs to be passed on in every step of the chain. So that's why we find it so important that there is a pull effect, in a way, from the food company side as well, and from the consumer side in the end, to make sure that the appropriate cost of carbon is included in the end product.
Yeah, and you're working actively on this at Yara. And there's a question from the audience. What coordinated strategies and policies are we missing to achieve commercial maturity of key green technologies such as green ammonia?
Yeah, I think what you're talking about here is indeed the green in a way chemicals is the same challenge that is also there, for example, in green steel or green cement. And then what we see is that basically the energy transition in the end was also facilitated, for example, the energy Wende in Germany by feed-in tariffs, by a first boost of support in the public domain. And then we see that has created so much energy, and more importantly, it has created a strong cost reduction in solar, in offshore wind, in offshore and onshore wind as well. So that boost makes that now a lot of projects go unsubsidized, and we need to rethink a system where this first boost can also be given. And what we, for example, see a lot is discussions about carbon contracts of differences, which are coming up in several settings. So on one hand, that injection or boost is important, and on the other hand, we see a lot indeed in consumer behavior, in willingness to pay for zero carbon food, etc. Directly incentivized publicly, or maybe by a pull from the customers themselves. Yeah.
Sam, I'm going to let Asgeir, one of our experts, ask you a question, because I know he's eager and ready to do so, and here we have him on screen. So Asgeir.
So thank you for a very interesting presentation again, and I really like the way you look at the complete value chain for agriculture and how to reduce emissions in this very important value chain. But if you look at your presentation, of course, even if the agricultural value chains are going to be crucial, when you talk about ammonia and hydrogen, for that sake, this is one of the energy carriers that has a potential to be a real game changer, both in agriculture, in industry, in transport, and maybe also in heating. And that makes it very interesting from our perspective to discuss the future about this technology or energy carrier in terms of, if this really takes off, there will be a huge market for ammonia and hydrogen. So you could easily see yourself from being a fertilizer company to being a large-scale producer of a very valuable input like ammonia or hydrogen. And I know you have a slight preference for ammonia in that respect. And I think that's going to be a global commodity if this comes through. And in that respect, it's interesting to look at where to produce it. And as you say, if you look at the green ammonia, that's probably going to be produced in locations with plenty of renewable resources. And I just want to also sidestep a little bit, and in hydrogen we start talking about blue hydrogen coming from the natural gas and CCS, which is not so far from the way you produce hydrogen in Yara today, except you don't have CCS. And I want to just hear your reflections on the scalability. Let's say that these markets become huge, and if you look at ammonia, it's going to be a global commodity, and you may or may not be interested in how it was produced as long as it's emission free. So do you have any views on the role of how to produce this in large scale if it really takes off as a global commodity? And do you think it will be a situation where the renewables will win and we can only talk about green ammonia, or will we have this opportunities also to use, for example, natural gas and CCS to produce it?
Yeah, I think you pose a very rich question, right? What we in essence believe is that that the technology as such is not the main hurdle in essence, but for green or for CCS, technology-wise, it can happen, right? It definitely needs to be scaled up. There needs to be cost reductions in the supply chains, in the equipment. Definitely yes, but that can happen. But the challenge will indeed be the capital intensity of making this at global scale, right? Because a hydrogen unit or an ammonia unit will take several years to build, is extremely capital intensive. So the key will be on how will it be de-risked sufficiently, right? Which can have many different elements of green finance, of early off-takers, etc. So in a way, if it can be sufficiently de-risked either in the public domain or from the market side, then in principle the ball can get rolling and it can be scaled up, right? But we have to take into account that these are in a way assets that take a long time to build, and these are and need to replace over time long-lived assets as well, right? So. And we would see the same, for example, on shipping vessels as well. It's the same principle. It's a very capital-intensive asset, a new vessel, and the vessels which are there today have, in principle, long lifetimes. So you need to start that process now.
Good. Now, Sam, your sound was cut off, and I didn't do that, I promise.
It's probably me. I'm back.
But the thing is, we have to move on, and you can both get back to this once we're discussing in the panel discussion, because I guess the others might have some perspectives on that as well. So thank you to both Sam and Asgeir for now. We're going to see you later on. And we will move on in our program, because the next sector that we're going to scrutinize is the building construction industry, or the 30% sector as it is often referred to, responsible for approximately 36% of the global energy use and nearly 40% of the global emissions. With such numbers, I guess the reduction potential is huge. For individual buildings, certainly, but just imagine what impact it could have when entire neighborhoods are planned and built as zero-emission buildings, or entities even. That is exactly what our next speaker is looking into. Arild Gustavsen is Director of the Research Center on Zero-Emission Neighborhoods, the ZEN, in Smart Cities, and Professor in Building Physics at the NTNU. He will let us in on some projects and show us what there is to gain, but also what obstacles to surpass in order to obtain truly emission-free neighborhoods. Arild Gustavsen, I will leave the scene to you now. Take it away.
Thank you for this opportunity to give this presentation at this webinar. The title of the presentation is Smart and Emission-Free Cities, the contribution from zero-emission buildings and neighborhoods. Sustainable cities and communities is one of the areas covered by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And the main aim is to make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. And the reason for addressing cities is that more than 50% of the world's population now lives in cities, and that this will increase to about 66% by the year 2050. In addition, we see that cities are getting bigger. In 1990, there were 10 megacities with 10 million people or more. And in 2014, there were 28 megacities, home to more than 450 million people. So it's important to make cities sustainable for all. And to do this, we need sustainable housing and sustainable buildings. We also need more sustainable transport options, and we need to create green spaces and get a broader range of people involved in urban planning decisions. At the same time, we know that buildings and the buildings construction sector combined are responsible for 36% of the global final energy use and nearly 40% of the total direct and indirect CO2 emissions. And even beyond that, we know that the energy use and related emissions may double or potentially even triple by mid-century because of the need for adequate housing and related facilities, especially for people in developing countries, and also because of population growth and migration to cities and the increase of levels of wealth and lifestyles. Some of this is the background for why EU now is implementing nearly zero energy building codes. And we also see strategy documents pointing towards positive energy districts. And in Norway, we have also looked at the zero emission building concept, addressing the whole life cycle of buildings. And where we look at the emissions from the whole life cycle, including the materials, the construction phase, the operational phase, and also the demolition phase. And we then need renewable energy production harvested or produced on the building or nearby the building to compensate for all these emissions. So in practice, this is actually also a plus energy building. And we have realized together with partners 8 buildings aiming for the zero emission building target. We also looked at what can happen if we implement zero emission building ambition levels in the building code. And we see that even with an increase in the built area from 2020 to 2050, we can have a decrease in energy use up till 39 terawatt hours from 2020 to 2050. This is in the most ambitious scenario we have studied. However, we see that aiming for the zero emission building target for each and every building might not be feasible. It might also not be possible, for instance, for heritage buildings. So that's why we have increased the scale and are now working on the neighborhood scale, where we look at a group of buildings and related infrastructure. So the objective here is to speed up decarbonization of the building stock, both existing buildings and new buildings, use more renewable energy sources, and create positive synergies among the building stock, energy, ICT, and mobility systems and citizens. And we are working with the municipalities and cities and also other public and private project developers to realize these concepts in real areas. So the aim is then to reduce the direct and indirect greenhouse gas emissions towards zero within the life cycle of the neighborhood. And then we consider 60 years the life cycle of a building, and 100 years the service life of infrastructure. And in addition to looking at the greenhouse gas emissions, we also look at energy efficiency. We would like the neighborhood to be powered by a high share of new renewable energy, and also to have interaction with the energy supply system. In addition, we would like to manage the energy flow, smart management of the energy flow within the neighborhood and between buildings, and also exchange energy with the surrounding energy system in a smart and flexible way. The zero emission neighborhood should promote sustainable transport patterns and smart mobility systems. The zero emission neighborhood should further plan, design, and operate with respect to economic sustainability. The amenities in the neighborhood should provide good spatial qualities and stimulate sustainable behavior. And the area should also be characterized by innovative processes based on new forms of cooperation between the involved partners and lead to innovative solutions. New business models and looking at the regulatory framework is part of this. In the Zero Emission Neighborhood Research Center, we have 9 demonstration areas that we use in our research. From Bodø in the north to Bærum in the south. This is a mix of new developments and transformation of existing areas, and looking at buildings, looking at energy infrastructure, looking at citizen engagement processes is part of this. We have started to evaluate the performance of several of these areas, and this is one example from the area Ydalir, where we look at the emissions from the buildings, from mobility, from the infrastructures, and also evaluate the renewable energy production possibilities, for instance, based on photovoltaics and the district heating system. And we see that aiming for the zero emission neighborhood ambition level is very ambitious. And with the current plans, we are not yet at the target. But still we see that aiming for these ambitions results in a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Stronger focus is needed on mobility, materials, and renewable energy production. This is the last slide, and it's time to conclude. I think making zero emission buildings and neighborhoods, or aiming for these targets, will help the transition to a low carbon society. For instance, by reducing the energy use and the greenhouse gas emissions related to buildings and neighborhoods with related infrastructure. And then I think of both direct emissions and indirect emissions. Further, we see that implementation of these targets will result in more renewable energy production. We will see that flexibility measures are explored both in the neighborhood with associated infrastructure, but also within buildings. And we also see sector coupling in place. Further, we see the reduction of material use. There is more use of environmental friendly materials and also more use of old materials. And there is also reduction of transportation need because of improved planning processes and also introduction of more sustainable transport options. But there are also challenges. For instance, there are quite a lot of regulatory barriers in place today. And there are also problems related to having different building owners or different authorities to relate to for several of the topics we are considering. That was it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arild, for showing us the complexity of reaching zero emission neighborhoods, because this is not easy. And I can see that you're back on camera again. Nice to have you back. And I know that both of our experts might want to ask you questions in this thesis defense style. So I'm going to re-invite both Asgeir and Tomas to join us. Let's see if they're popping into the screen. There we go. So Tomas was first, so now you can go first, and I'm gonna just lean back and listen to whatever questions you might have. Tomas.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks. So thanks for a very nice presentation. There's a lot of really great work going on in the SEN Center, so thanks for that. I have a question sort of on your framing or setup of this presentation and the relationship to the sort of work that goes on to realize these smart zero emission neighborhoods and cities. And this is set out by sort of citing the UN and with a sort of massive focus on inclusivity, safety, resilience, and sustainability. And I guess throughout the presentation, I sort of got the impression that the key measure of success is sort of the technical parameters and you know, the greenhouse gas emissions. These two things are obviously clearly important. But I wonder, do you also work to sort of measure these other things, such as participation, inclusivity, resilience, safety, and could you say a few words about how you do that in the center?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, the presentation is focusing, or was focusing, mostly on the technology side, I think, and on the CO2 emissions. But the user engagement and working with different actors is actually a large part of the center as well. So for instance, we have these living laboratories, the experiments we do connected to some of these pilot projects. So so this is some examples, and then it can be to sort of explore non-technical measures to reduce the emission as well. So it's covering a lot more than what I managed to put in this 9-minute presentation. Yes.
A follow-up question, or should we pass the word on to Asgeir?
Yeah, I figured we were sort of out of time, so I was prepared to pass the word. So just to go ahead and do that.
Asgeir.
Okay, so thank you. So you mentioned, Arild, that it's a quite ambitious target to have a zero-emission neighborhood perspective. And I guess if you look at the big picture, the important thing is to have a zero-emission society. And from my perspective, one interesting topic would be let's say you get close to zero emission neighborhoods, but not all the way. Maybe it would be as important to interact with the rest of society, to interact with the transport sector through the flexibility, for example, in electric vehicles, to interact with industry through low temperature heat or other spillover heat from industry, and more or less to interact sort of being a flexibility provider into a system where with a lot of intermittent renewables, probably flexibility will be in high demand. So do you have any reflections on how to balance this zero emission objective towards another objective that would be helping the rest of society to go zero emission?
It's a big question, right? I think we, in the Sen Center, try to take a more holistic view on things that are compared to many other centers. We are including transport. We are including, or pushing for more flexibility and to adopt more renewable energy, and also, of course, energy efficiency, and also pushing for more renewable energy production. So I think moving the focus from individual buildings or only from transport, we sort of take on a more holistic view in the way we do this. Yes, but if we tackle everything, I'm not sure that's possible within one center, but I think we're on the right track at least. Hope I partly answered your question at least.
Yes, indeed.
Are you satisfied, Asgeir?
Yeah, I think this is something we probably can follow up a little bit in the discussions later as well. But
yeah. Well, thank you. So thank you so far, Arild and Asgeir. But Arild, you can stay put on camera. Asgeir will absent himself for a couple of minutes now, because I would first of all like to thank all the 5 presenters for giving us so different and very interesting perspectives, and I hope that you're all ready to discuss some more. So if the 4 that we're not seeing now could reactivate their cameras so that we have a full panel of speakers, and also remember to reactivate your microphones. And let's talk together, because now we've been sort of interrogating one-on-one, but 6 people, or at least the 5 of you, I think you can think very well together as well, and listening to one another. The first question from me would be, would you say that you are, and listen carefully to the nuance of this question, are you optimistic or pessimistic about the energy transition being fulfilled in time to have a real and positive effect on greenhouse gas emissions and climate change? Huge question, but the answer is either yes, I'm positive or optimistic. No, I'm a bit pessimistic. And I would like to start with you, Jim, because you mentioned these 2 words, optimism and pessimism, when we were talking earlier on. What do you think?
It depends when you ask me. I think I'm optimistic on technology and costs. We can afford it and we know how to do it. I'm less optimistic on the will of companies and governments in particular to put in place the policies that really are needed. You know, building on my talk, I'm actually quite optimistic about the people side, but they do need the right context. They can't be just told to go and behave properly or behave differently without anybody giving them the reason why and the means to do so. So it depends on what dimension for me.
Yeah, I think that's a very good answer. Comments from the others. Hege, for instance, you were challenged to be more active in pushing the transition forward, both in offering your products to your clients, but also, you know, taking the big responsibility. And Jim said, yeah, sometimes he's optimistic, sometimes he's a pessimist, and the pessimism was also regarding the industry. What do you think?
Yeah, but I think we have several initiatives to reduce emissions. We are working together with Yara on the Yara Birkeland, which is a fully electric vessel. We are also working very actively to reduce fuel consumption when it comes to the maritime industry overall, as we are a big player in that field. We have tried to develop solutions on win, but we have seen that the payment and the prices are too low, basically. So we have stopped those initiatives. So we are working in different angles there, and I think that there's also opportunities not only to reduce in the existing structures, but also to change the structures. So if you, for instance, look at the maritime industry, they still haven't fully implemented the slot times in ports, meaning that they are steaming ahead across the ocean, and then they are docking in the large ports around the world. So I think there is many opportunities, but this is a transformation that takes some time. But we try to contribute across multiple industries at the moment. The reason why I wanted to show you the oil and gas example is because we still have to depend on oil and gas for a while. So we need to make sure that it's safe and it's as clean as possible.
Regarding that, Hege, there was a question from the audience actually that I'm gonna give to you now, even though I would like to hear the others when it comes to optimism and pessimism. But with the current experience from the digital twin of oil and gas platforms, do you at the KDI have any future plans to invest on digital twins when it comes to offshore wind?
We have been thinking about it, and I think we have parts of the solution already in place, but we still need to see that there's an interest from the offshore wind producers and operators. So sometimes down the line, maybe, but not in a few years, I think. But on grids, I think, which is the critical part actually now, with the EVs coming in and the change towards more electric heating for households, etc. The balancing and flexibility in the grids is of huge importance, I think.
Sam, your company is trying to think holistically and through the entire value chain. What about your sense of optimism? Is it present, or do you think that this is way too big, way too far away, and we don't have enough time to do it?
No, I think we definitely should be optimistic, and I think what was also mentioned by David, the direction of the post-COVID stimulus packages, I think that will learn us a lot, right? Which direction will they go? Will they go towards green transition, at least in Europe, or will they go the other way? I think that can either accelerate and give us a chance to be in time, or it can slow it down and increase the risk of that scenario with a nosedive, right, as you depicted, David, where action is delayed another 10 years and then suddenly it needs to be cranked up at a massive speed. So, but I think the fact that at least in post-COVID it is on many agendas, I think is a positive sign, right? It's at least considered to put that package partly towards green and energy transformation.
And that, with that, we can pass the ball on to David. What is your level of optimism at the moment? Oh, you're off the sound here. So could you just make sure you, hang on, I'm going to unmute you. There you go. Oh, we did it at the same time. So now you're muted again. Please unmute your microphone and then you can start over again.
Yeah, I think I was muted by an organizer. Yeah, I mean, notwithstanding, I think the fantastic efforts we've heard about on this webinar, my answer would be kind of slightly pessimistic, I'm afraid. I'd say in terms of Europe, I can see there is kind of momentum for, taking these risks seriously, and very much as Sammy said, in this post-COVID environment, the idea of stimulus packages being tilted towards green growth, I think, is definitely on the table. My source of pessimism is really because this does need to be a global effort, and I'm not seeing the same level of discussion over in the States or in Asia. So what we do in Europe, I think, will only have a marginal impact on the nature of the issue. So for me, I'm afraid the most likely scenario is it's a delay. We will transition at some stage, but I think it will necessarily require kind of a much more abrupt change, maybe triggered by some catastrophic climate events, to actually change people's globally change people's approach. Anyway.
Hege, were you giving an index because you wanted to talk?
Yeah, because I think that if you look at China, for instance, they are investing more in renewable energy than than the rest of the world at the moment. They also have the stimulus packages focused on really making their industries more efficient and smarter and less consumptions. So I think the investment is enormous, and it's really around smart shipping, renewables, intelligent oil fields to reduce emissions, etc. So a lot is going on in China at the moment.
But at the same time, we heard the president of the Beijing Energy Club, Xavier Chen, last week stating that, coal is still going to be part of the equation. Fossil fuels will be around as long as humans are around, and we're going to use it. And yes, of course, they are big in renewables at the same time. But this I don't know, dichotomy maybe of huge nations as China and also the United States. You mentioned the US, David, and you know the States quite well as having spent time there and worked there. What do we need to get a nation as the US on board within the financial sector to sort of change their way of investing?
Shall I pick that up? It's very difficult. My sense is there's a big dichotomy between the political rhetoric at the federal level in the US and what's happening more on the ground in financial institutions where the issue is being treated seriously, certainly in the central banking community where it's being treated seriously. But I think it will require this kind of federal approach as well to implement, to actually affect change. But you only have to visit the country to realize, the approach to energy use is very, very different to Europe. Car usage being the obvious example. So, yeah, that's my source of skepticism. I think that this is something that's on the immediate agenda.
Arild, you're the next one in line here, and of course you could also give us your view on whether you're optimistic or pessimistic. But you were describing also in this complexity of the emission-free neighborhoods quite a few barriers, and Hege was also mentioning the fact that when everyone has to get into the nitty-gritty, the details, and we actually have to act and do the things. Policies help a certain way, but how are we actually going to do the transformation? What is your take on that in your center?
First, to answer the first question first, it's a difficult question, I think, but I would like to be optimistic, even if I see that this will be very difficult and complex. So within our research center and also in general in Norway, we see that more and more people get involved. And this is sort of end users like any one of us, I think, but also municipalities. You see building developers, project developers go beyond the minimum requirements. So people want to contribute. And I hope this change will continue. So more and more people would like to contribute and make sure we will meet these climate goals. But at the same time, I think we need more active policies in place, and then from the governments, of course. And this can both be economic support or subsidies, but it can also be more or stricter regulations. So I think we need a bit of both in addition to the involvement of the people and the end users to get there. But I'm hopefully, yeah, or I'm positive, yes, but it's a big question.
Yeah,
And
it is.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to ask Jim, because I can see you're nodding when Arild was talking. Who do you think, or what do you think, will be the pivotal force in speeding up the transition? Is it going to be the public? Is it active policies with concrete targets and measures and actions? Or could it be the financial sector moving forward and divesting and investing in specific directions?
I think it very much depends on the sector and the country. I don't think there is a kind of single answer to that question. So if you're thinking, for example, vehicles, we kind of know what the technology solution is, at least for cars. Their cities are obviously wanting to get people to use other transport modes as well. Whereas for heating, certainly in the UK and probably other countries, we have a huge debate about which way is the best way forward, massive uncertainty. So there's a bit more emphasis there on experimenting, demonstrating solutions. There's a huge politics going on of the gas industry wanting to preserve its existence and convert itself to hydrogen. And on the other hand, people saying, actually, that's a complete waste of time and we should go electric and have heat pumps in all our homes. So it's become very political as the era of heat, and that makes it very different from, say, surface transport or power generation. So it really does depend. But I think all of these areas, even if we kind of know what the solution is, we do need strong policy. I would say that as a professor of energy policy, we need strong policy and regulation. A general carbon price is not going to cut it. It's politically difficult to do. You need very specific policies in specific areas. They work. And if you do that right, you'll probably have to push industry more than it wants to. But if you do that right, then you can start making the change as quickly as you can. But, tailored to the sector and the context.
Yeah. So this gives me a great opportunity, and thank you for that very broad and academic answer. And that gives me a good opportunity to re-invite our two experts into the discussion. Now, we're going to hit some technical challenges here, because we have the possibility of only 6 people visible and present at the time. So I'm going to absent myself visually, but you're going to hear me, rest assured. So bye for now, but I'm going to continue talking, because Asgeir and Tomas, they would like to join in, and they will have to switch between them when it comes to who is asking questions to the speakers panel. So maybe we should invite Tomas first. Is there anything you would like to add to the discussion, Tomas?
Yeah, thanks. It's been really illuminating to listen to this great group of people. Maybe just to add to this optimism or pessimism thing, because it's been on the table here. The policies are important, and several people have mentioned COVID-19 and potential for stimulus packages and these types of things as a potential accelerator. Now, and this might be controversial how to interpret different countries' policies and things like that. But I mean, in the Norwegian case, it's quite clear that the liquidity packages have massively gone in the direction of our existing. I know I've heard from you that I shouldn't say oil and gas, but I'll do it anyway. Industry, and which is, I think, understandable in the sense that we have huge human, industrial, physical investments in that sector, and they've been hugely important for the welfare of this country. But it is, on the other hand, quite challenging and discouraging in terms of thinking about prospects of radically moving towards decarbonization. I mean, when we, as let's say, richest or one of the wealthier countries in the world, cannot use this opportunity to more strongly, forcefully push the sort of green transition agenda, I really do not think we should expect other countries who are equally reliant on the fossil fuel industry to do so. So that's one of the reasons why I tilt towards slight pessimism on this path, not because of people or other sort of barriers out there, but because there are strong sort of forces working to other ends. So I don't know. Maybe the panel might reflect on this. It wasn't a question. This it was more comments.
Anyone who would like to comment on Thomas's comment? Jim.
Yeah, I think it's a very good point, and there's an understandable temptation for governments, especially when confronted with something so big and so immediate as coronavirus, to just shore up the things just to make sure things don't fall apart. People have wages, companies don't suddenly collapse. That does then mean that you're really trying, if you do that immediate thing, to keep the economy as usual going as much as possible. I think in the medium term, and by medium term I only mean in the next year or two, there is an opportunity to think more clearly about how we want the economy to be as we come out and into the new normal, whatever that is. And as one of my colleagues at UCL put it, who advises UK government and other governments, this is the maximum point of leverage for government. You know, you've got all these companies coming to government saying, please bail me out, we're going to collapse. Now, government could just sort of say, yes, no problem. Or in many cases, it could say, particularly with those where you have a big carbon footprint and the areas that need to change, airlines, oil and gas, etc. You could say, you can have some money, but here's some conditions. You know, airlines, you must invest in low carbon technology. Maybe you have to foresee a scenario where you don't grow as much in terms of air passenger numbers. Maybe you have to invest in greenhouse gas removal. If you don't do any of that, you're not getting the money. And we can really learn lessons from what happened after 2008. So, you know, particularly in the US, they bailed out the car industry, no conditions were attached. The car industry then carried on and actually ended up being challenged by foreign manufacturers who developed smaller, more efficient cars. So actually, I think in the medium term, this is actually helpful for industry. It might sound strange. So I do think that is the time, but that window is going to close soon. So I do think, you know, more, not just a green tinge to the recovery, it has to be really a central plank of what government does for me.
David.
Add one thing. You know, I really like the question, the way it's framed, and I also very much agree with Jim's response. I think it is useful to kind of differentiate between the kind of immediate response and, as Jim said, you know, the opportunity that now exists over the next year or two, which does feel like a fork in the road moment to me, in terms of, you know, we either kind of cement the existing production technology we have, or kind of embark on a new course. One reason for kind of slight optimism here is, you know, in economics we think about this idea of a fiscal multiplier, which is, you know, if the government spends some money, how big an impact will it have on the economy? And my sense is, like, a lot of the green projects that could underlie the recovery are things that will tend to have higher multipliers, just because their impact on productivity will be much greater than supporting you know, the airline industry, say, which we know, you know, cannot exist in its current form. So that's kind of a slight, you know, reason for optimism here.
Thomas, do you are you satisfied with the comments that you received here?
Yeah, I'm pretty happy with these comments. I mean, I agree with this sentiment that there is also the sort of next step in policy making. We have had this immediate thing now, which still, I think, has cemented, poured money into existing structures, but then there is the next opportunity. So maybe you're right in that there is ground for optimism. Let's hope it doesn't just stay with kind of that discourse, that it also sort of feeds into the practice of both policymakers and sort of the industry surrounding.
Hege, would you like to comment on this? Because yeah, I know that you showed us an example from the oil and gas industry, because as you said, we know they will be there for quite some time. We need to help them, you know, be more efficient, more energy efficient, reduce their emissions as far as you can. But are you able to do two things at the same time, you know, helping them out, but at the same time use a lot of energy into R&D for you know, a new and a greener path, finding new solutions for other actors in this big puzzle that we're dealing with.
Yeah, I would say that we do, and I mentioned a couple of examples earlier on. I think that the challenge is always when is the right time to invest. Of course, that in some areas it's also regulations that's preventing the changes happening. And you can see that with the utility grid companies, for instance, which has incentives from the government, not only in Norway, but in multiple countries. That's really based upon traditional ways of operating, which had given an opportunity. And I've also mentioned the work that we are doing on the maritime industry overall, which I think is picking up in a good way, also helped by IMO when it comes to regulations on reduced emissions. So there are several things that's moving in the right direction here. So it's always a balancing act, I think, with the consumption pattern and the regulations and the technology opportunities in this space.
Yeah. Sam, I would like to convey a question from the audience to you. It's a bit more on the technical side, but at the same time it shows us a bit the potential shortcomings of some of the emission plans and targets that we have. So when it comes to climate neutral agriculture, methane produced by agricultural residues might be a point of concern. Most of the plans are targeting only CO2. How do you go about that?
Yeah, in agricultural emissions, you have CO2, you have N2O, like laughing gas, which is very important and highly contributing to the climate change, and you have methane as well, right? Now, in the area where Yara is active, methane is a bit less prominent, right? Because it's also very much associated to meat production, etc., and to the cows, where we can less directly influence. But I really do think that, of course, all the elements should be part of the policies, right? So it should be a holistic view on all types of emissions. But what we see today is that it's only emerging. Agriculture is only emerging in national climate plans, in the NDCs for the Paris Agreement. It's more and more on the agenda, but there is very little regulation so far, right? But what we see, for example, what goes in the right direction is in Europe, massive subsidies go to the agricultural sector through the Common Agricultural Policy, and there is a lot of discussion on repurposing part of these subsidies, basically towards environmental and climate performance on the farm as well, which has to do with the right type of inputs, applying them in the right way. Ideally field specific with the right applications behind. So we see that there is in a way a drive also there to repurpose at least part of the subsidies towards climate-friendly agriculture, which is something we really need, right? Because then you incentivize from the farmer from the other side as well. Today, he's basically not really recognized, or it's very difficult for a farmer to monetize on being green, right? And often he needs that to just be able to stay in business, right? He cannot just go green because he likes to. He needs to have a business model behind that one as well, and that could be methane or N2O emissions or a combination of all types.
Yeah, a quick question also from the audience, Sam, and I know that Asgeir was mentioning it when you talked earlier. Do you see a future for blue hydrogen in the future energy system? And if so, how can it be facilitated? I don't expect you to give the full answer to that. If anyone else in the panel feels inclined to answer, they might do so. But let's start with
I think in Yara we agree with the general consensus that blue might have a role in the transition. I think when you really look at the end game, we see that in a way green production technologies can or will be more cost effective in the end road. There is also less public concerns in a way in general around it, as was mentioned by one of the speakers as well. But it could have a role in the transition in the meantime, right? But what we see, for example, the tangible projects we have today are more on the green side, because that's something we can attach to our own production sites, and there is kind of less external dependence. I think on CCS there is still a lot of political dependence in a way, whether that will happen or not. So that's why our pilot projects are rather green than blue, but we don't go so far to fully exclude one road or the other when it comes to the transition, basically.
Yeah. And Arild, would you say that hydrogen, blue or green or whatever, has an important role to play in the smart cities and the emission-free neighborhoods?
This is a bit beyond my research area, but I think hydrogen can be a solution, and especially related to transport. Yeah, I think that will be my short answer.
That's good. So if anyone feels inclined to comment on anything, just raise your index finger and I'll pay attention. I saw Jim's finger. You were actually pointing, and I didn't mention that earlier, but please forgive me for pointing that out now. But if the audience can see into their screens and see behind you, you have all these numbers behind you, which means that you are a marathon runner, and you've done a lot of marathons, I know. And I was thinking that is probably helpful, being persistent when you're doing climate and energy research, is it not?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very good analogy, really, and especially the pain of the last 6 miles. I don't even think we're there yet for the reaching net zero. But yeah, for anybody that's done one, they'll know what I mean. I just wanted to comment on hydrogen, though, rather than my pastime outside work.
Of course.
I think I agree with what Sammy said, which is that blue has a role as potentially as a transition. I think the other reason it may have a role is that because CCS, although we prefer not to do it because it uses a lot of energy and money and so on, and if we didn't have to use CCS, I don't think we'd bother. But it also becomes relevant, I think, for both Norway and the UK with respect to negative emissions. And certainly if you look at our pathway to net zero in the UK, you can't do it without some form of negative emissions. Now that of course can include afforestation and changing land use management practices, which Sammy was talking about, but it also may need bioenergy with carbon capture, direct air capture, some variants of those. And so it gives you that insurance policy by developing your carbon storage infrastructure. That is a potential thing you could use for negative emissions too. So it's not just, I don't think we should just see it through the lens of what we need for the energy we need for various activities, whether it be shipping or heating houses. There's also this negative emissions dimension, which again, has a lot of risks, and we should be careful about it. But writing off CCS entirely reduces the number of options that we've then got to actually meet net zero, rather than getting to 90% reduction, but no further.
Thomas, I would like to ask you to swap places with Asgeir, because he's been patiently waiting to get into the panel. So now we're going to re-welcome Asgeir Tomasgard. He is probably pushing the button of his camera. There he is. So Asgeir, what would you like to add to the discussion?
Yes, so thank you. So one observation in particular when we have been talking about industrial game changers is related to the interfaces with finance and investments and money. It's about timing, and of course it's difficult to find the right timing when you're entering into immature markets, but we have this discussion when it comes to ammonia and scaling up green ammonia from renewables. We have this discussion when it comes to Kongsberg Digital and moving into offshore wind and digital twins. We have this discussion when it comes to zero emission neighborhoods, and do you really go zero emission in a neighborhood? And I think this is all about someone is going to invest, and most people and institutions that invest would like to at one point have their money back. And when it comes to the role of financial institutions, I think you, David, gave a very good presentation on how it works. I think, I don't mean to be negative, but you say you have sort of an indirect approach from financial institutions to promoting the transition through, I would say, stress testing and pricing risk. A more direct approach is taken by some in ethical investments, saying we pull out of coal and we don't invest in coal from an ethical perspective, not discussing the economics in this. So for me, there's something interesting in how could the financial institutions, maybe not the central banks, but you see also situations where the central banks do this, for example, through the investments in the pension fund pulling out of coal. But how could the financial institutions speed up the transition? And should the financial institutions speed up the transition, or should they be passive in terms of stress testing and pricing?
That's a really, it's a very difficult question. You know, financial institutions invest on the basis of the incentives we provide them. You know, as you say, they want a return for their money. We're living in a world where risk-free returns are effectively negative on a real basis. So there's a dearth of profitable investment opportunities. There's a huge amount of savings globally. So I kind of see this, you know, the situation is very kind of, you know, it's a very good situation in terms of the money is there to invest in the projects. It just, from my perspective, is that the incentives are just tilted the wrong way right now. So we're actually still subsidizing investments into brown assets rather than the other way around. I think this transition won't happen by itself. It does require government intervention, I think. That's my perspective, at least, to kind of tilt the balance much more actively towards green investments. You know, financial institutions, they won't want to be the last people kind of holding these assets. So at some stage, there will be, you know, a catalyst towards investing more in green. But again, these institutions have very short time horizons when you're making investment decisions, particularly banks. You know, the typical corporate loan is 3 years, say. So, you know, I hate to say this, but the perspective will be, you know, this is kind of someone else's problem down the road. I don't want to lose my job as a CEO of a large institution. So I think it does require public policy to actually correct those distorted incentives. Yeah, and I think central banks themselves can, you know, there's things we can do to kind of, in our own investments, in QE that was mentioned earlier. I think Thomas's question about, you know, where the liquidity support has been provided in the crisis. All of those things I think can and should be tilted away from brown assets. But that's only going to be a small part of the picture. I don't know if others have perspectives on this.
Yeah, so I just want to follow up on that, because I've heard that several times before also. It's a good answer, and it's a difficult question, I agree. But one of the typical answers we get when we ask these kind of questions is the money out there, we are looking for the good investments. And that's something that makes me curious, because if you look at it, it's quite likely that the return on investments will be much higher within these high growth parts of the economy than in, let's say, in coal and for that sake, oil. Maybe not natural gas, I'll give you that. So my curiosity is more around, when will we see this tipping point where you realize that you should have invested before and the opportunities were there, you were just too late to catch them?
Yeah, and if you like, another perspective on this is to kind of look at previous big technological revolutions, you know, going all the way back to the Industrial Revolution. My understanding of those periods is, you know, they did all require some kind of public policy interventions as well as societal changes. You know, it's very hard to kind of anticipate exactly when that tipping point will come. I'm afraid I haven't got a good answer to that. My sense is it will come, and we'll probably see the reverse problem. We'll see like a bubble in green energy finance at some stage. That will come with its own problems in terms of investments going into the wrong types of investments. But
could be interesting to hear the industrial leaders' perspective on this as well.
Hege, you mean?
No, but I think that it's of course an opportunity for significant growth, but the discussion is when and how and what type of role are you allowed to take in that industry. So given that there's so many uncertainties, it's really increasing the risk factor. So even though you see significant opportunities on a growth level, you see that risk is high in the current environment.
And Sam, would you like to add something?
I can only echo basically what Hege said. In principle, if you look at hydrogen, in a way, it is still in a way risk on for the investors, right? There is uncertainty on at least for the large scale at the off takers, on the willingness to pay, on the carbon price as well, right? Which is a massive uncertainty, both in national, EU, or global contexts, right? And there is no clear vision on where the carbon price will go, which for quite a few projects is a determining factor as well. So what we see indeed, that then the financing conditions are still mainly related to the risk, right? And there might be a very small deduction because it's green and sustainable, but in essence, the hurdle rate is still extremely high because it's a high risk project with many uncertainties in the end, right? So I'm also curious to see when this tipping point will happen, but we don't really see it so far either. It's really uncertainty and risk, which are still the dominant words here, I think.
Short comment from Hege, quickly.
Yeah, I think that if you look at the regulation, that's a part of the equation. But I think also if you look at the significant government procurement that's done in multiple countries, if those are refocused to actually create a market earlier on. And get the good solutions in for buildings, for the different parts that we have talked about, whether it's transportation, etc. There's a huge opportunity within that, I think.
Now, dear panel, all good things must come to an end, and we have to wrap things up now. So I'm going to give each of you 30 seconds to conclude. And I know that's strict, 30 seconds. And also, if the experts would like to have a 30-second wrap-up, they can have that. But I'm going to start with the speakers panel. And the question I'm asking, or to help you into that 30-second final remark, is what is your final take-home message to us in light of the topic and the discussion we just had? So maybe, Jim, would you like to start?
I can. I mean, to go to your title, the game is changing, okay? So we have the game changing in terms of technology. We have the game changing in terms of people and public awareness. As I said in my answer to your first question, that's higher than it's ever been. And then we're at this very unprecedented time with, a global pandemic and an opportunity, as we've said, despite the sadness and the difficulty of what's happened, for governments in particular, but I think companies too, to really stand up and say, right, now we're going to do something differently. And I think we've seen some hints through our conversation about what that might look like from the finance perspective, from the industry perspectives, and some of the areas where things need to change.
Great, thank you. That was 30 seconds, spot on. Perfect. David?
I'm not sure how to follow what Jim said. It was so comprehensive, but I'll just say, I mean, for me, it's kind of a non-expert in this area. First of all, it's super exciting to hear about some of the initiatives on the science side. I found all of those contributions fascinating, and I think just to echo what Jim said about now being a really opportune time for us to kind of take the leap we do need to. This is the kind of right opportunity with the situation the world finds itself in. So that's kind of the source for optimism.
Thank you very much. That was spot on 30 seconds as well. Perfect. So Hege, what would your final remark be?
I would say that I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic when it comes to the end users because their purchase pattern is going to influence this in the years to come. And if you look at the younger generation, they're very climate conscious. So I think that is going to transform. How long it's going to take and what's going to be sort of the key elements to drive it. Still remains to be seen, but I think we have discussed multiple of them today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Perfect. So, Sam.
As I said in the end of my presentation, alone we can do so little, together we can do so much. I think the real approach where policymakers, finance, industry and consumer work together, that's the way and the only way to go, because I think any isolated sector effort is going to be very suboptimal by default.
Thank you very much. And the final remark from Trondheim and Arild. I think you're muted, Arild, so you have to unmute your microphone.
Of course.
Thanks.
Yes, I think it's been a nice discussion and it's been interesting perspectives from many. And I think my final comment will be is that at least I see in my work that the companies, the municipalities, the citizens are changing. So I hope this change also will influence the way government govern and in this way accelerate the transition to a low carbon society.
Great. Now, I get the feeling that although some of you were a little bit pessimistic when I asked you about that earlier on, it seems like we've had a tiny shift towards optimism, and that is good because we need to work on these issues, all of us together, as Sam also pointed out so correctly. So before I say goodbye to the panel, I would ask the experts, would you like to have a short final remark as well? I'm going to absent myself visually once again. Thomas, would you like to start?
Sure. Yes. Final statement. I think we've never done this before. I mean, someone mentioned the historical transitions, and they're great examples, but in terms of energy, they've always been additions rather than transitions. So I would like to highlight how complex this challenge is, that we need concerted efforts across sectors, civil society, politicians, governments, and so on and so forth, and that we need it not sort of when our children grow up, but that we need it now. And I'd like to add that I agree with these sentiments, that it's an ample time in the wake of COVID to do so.
Right, thank you very much. And finally, Asgeir Tomasgard, the director of the initiative itself, your final remark to us.
I think it's been a very good discussion, and for me, I'm very interested in this timing question and the tipping point when you realize that you were too late to really take part in the major growth that will happen in the transition, and that could happen for companies and it could happen for nations. And I'm very interested in understanding better how we could promote these game-changing technologies, because I think with all game-changing technologies, they go from being unprofitable to being profitable very fast, and that means that this timing decision is critical, I think.
Thank you very much for that, Asgeir. So on that note, I would like to say once again, thank you so much to the 5 speakers. Now you're allowed to turn off your cameras and wave goodbye to us as you do that. And thank you very much. And I'm going to ask Asgeir to stay put for a couple of, well, 1 more minute. So what do you think, Asgeir? Now we've been through 3 webinars. There are 2 more to go, I think. And we are probably going to wait until August before we see the next one. What is going to happen then?
Well, the 2 ones that remains is one on radical innovation, both social innovation and technological innovation, and then there's going to be one about the visions of the future. And of course, they were carefully planned. If you remember, we started out with the first webinar, World in Crisis, and I think after today we're already on quite a more optimistic note, I would say. And let's hope that when we go into the visions of the future webinar, that it's really going to be optimistic visions of the future. So that's going to happen in the second half of August. And we are working on scheduling it as we speak.
So for those interested, they just have to watch closely on your website and probably on Facebook as well and other social media, and you will let us know when the next date is going to be. So in the meantime, I guess we could both wish everyone a nice summer, because holidays are coming soon.
Absolutely.
Should we do that? So we say goodbye, thank you for now, and see you again in the autumn. Bye.
Goodbye.